going to do a quick intro. Then Andrew Altschul is here to read from his new novel, The GRINGA. And then he's going to be joined by author Darcie Dennigan. Originally, this event was going to happen at our brick and mortar store in Providence, Rhode Island. But with the whole coronavirus craziness going on, we decided to do this to keep our community safe and still participate and be able to like be with each other and love books and do their thing. So without further ado, I'm gonna introduce Andrew and Darcie. So Andrew Altschul is the author of 3 novels, including most recently The GRINGA. His short fiction and essays have appeared in Esquire, McSweeney's, Plowshares, Best American Non-Fiction Reading, Best New American Voices, and O. Henry Prize Stories, among others. A former Wallace Stegner Fellow and Jones Lecturer at Stanford, he has also received fellowships from the Breadloaf and Sewanee Writers Conferences, among others. He is currently the Director of Creative Writing at Colorado State University. After his reading, he'll be joined by Darcie Dennigan, an award-winning poet and playwright whose books include Madam X and The Parking Lot and Other Feral Scenarios. She lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and let's do the thing. Here's Andrew.
Hi there. Probably most of you watching know that this is my Instagram debut, so far it's been a lot of fun. And I just want to start by thanking Emery and Alexa, who have been really wonderful and incredibly flexible and generous in this very strange time. If you don't know 20 Stories Bookstore, it's on Ives Street on the east side of Providence. And it's really just a wonderful store. If you're in Providence or if you're coming through at some point, please stop by and check it out. They're doing wonderful things here. Or look at their website, which is 20storiesla.com. If you think you might buy a book after the reading tonight, my book, Darcie's book, anybody's book, think about buying it from 20storiesla.com because we really need to support local bookstores right now. It's a tough time for everyone, but they're getting hit especially hard. So thanks for supporting local bookstores. So I'm going to read a short section from The GRINGA, which was published on Tuesday because I have fantastic timing. And like they said, this was going to be an in-store event. So now it's an event that people can watch from anywhere, and hopefully they are. The GRINGA is inspired by the true story of an American woman who in 1995 was arrested in Lima, Peru. She was renting a safe house for a group of Marxist militants who were plotting armed struggle against the government of Peru. She was convicted in a military court of collaborating with terrorists and of treason, and she spent 20 years in a military prison, 14,000 feet above sea level. In the novel, this character's name is Leonora Gelb, and the novel is being told by about 10 years after those events by an expatriate American novelist who goes only by the name of Andres. And Andres has sort of reluctantly agreed to write a profile about Leonora, and he's trying to figure out who this person is and how she ended up in that house in Lima, how she became the person who all of Peru came to hate and to think of as a terrorist from the United States. So he has to do a lot of imagining of her life and how she got to that point. And so I'm going to read a section about halfway through the book. He's imagined her college career at Stanford University and how she sort of drifted into radical politics during her time there. The other character who you'll encounter in this brief reading is named Marden Lee. He is a graduate student in a seminar that Leonora has been taking on radical politics, and he lives in the East Bay in Oakland in a house with a kind of neo-Black Panther cell. He and Leonora have been sleeping together, and he's been sort of gradually teaching her the the ways of the radical and of aggressive protest. This event takes place on the eve of the first Gulf War, so the night before the United States invaded Iraq in 1991. In San Francisco's Civic Center the next day, she followed Martin through a crowd of thousands, a surly and liquid mass that swelled and shifted, insinuating itself between buildings, swamping police lines, thumping drums and clanging pots and pans in an endless rattle that set the nerves on edge. The weather had cleared, the sky packed with fist-shaped clouds that wheeled around City Hall's gold dome. Speakers shouted into bullhorns, cursing President Bush and the oil companies. Signs stabbed the air. Stop the madness. Fags against war. An eye for an eye does not equal justice. As waves of outrage rolled through the plaza in deep orgasmic shudders. She hadn't eaten. Hunger and the buzz of coffee brought a sweat to her hairline. Unshowered under her long-sleeved shirt, she could smell her own slightly horsey scent mixed with his sharp musk. She was supposed to be in the library, working on an art history paper. While the bombs fell, while innocent people were maimed and incinerated, she was supposed to write a paper on Caravaggio. Unthinkable. She knew this was how most people lived, by somehow finding ways to write papers on Caravaggio while children in other countries were murdered, but Leonora would not be like most people. If you're doing this, you gotta be ready, Martin said at dawn. He told her to wear black, to take off her rings, leave her ID at home. They'd taken the train from Palo Alto, and Leo practiced glaring at well-dressed commuters until they turned away. As the sun moved behind the stately buildings, the undertow shifted toward Market Street and the financial district. The crowd was still growing, fed by side streets, a cacophony of car horns met by angry howls. Leo's pulse banged in her head. Cops in riot gear lined the sidewalks. Cries of pig and fascist, followed by the crack of glass bottles against plastic shields, metal thuds as bodies were thrown across the hoods of cars. Martin pulled her through the current and into a courtyard where a dozen men and women clustered nervously. A pink-faced teenager with a shaved head and full-sleeve tattoos handed out ski masks. Leo clutched hers in both hands and looked at Martin. "You can still go home," he said. "Vámonos," the tattooed kid said. As they neared Powell Street, the crowd barely moving, Leo kept her eyes on Martin's back. Into her head came a litany of things she needed to do. The Caravaggio paper, another on Plath and Sexton. It was her turn to clean the co-op's kitchen. Her father's birthday was next week, and she still had not bought him a gift. Her stomach hardened into a hot nut. Children were going to die for no reason, she reminded herself. What did Renaissance art matter? A few feet away, a naked woman painted with blue and orange flames hurled herself at a policeman. "You fucking murderers! You baby killers!" The cop barely got his shield up in time. 3 others grabbed the woman's flailing limbs, and she growled deep in her throat and spat at one cop's face mask, and he pulled a canister from his belt and sprayed her in the eyes. Leo felt herself duck, felt something whiz overhead, and then a great shattering as the window of a shoe store evaporated, raining glass on the police. Her mind whirled. This was the real thing, not a lecture or a photograph. She looked up at the surrounding office buildings where tiny faces watched the melee from dozens of windows. She couldn't imagine what they saw. "Wait," Leo said, snatching at Martin's sleeve. He shrugged her off. The air was suddenly bitter with smoke. "Where are we going?" But he was already forging ahead. Someone handed her a length of heavy pipe, and then they were pushed apart by a riptide of bodies in skin-tight skeleton suits who rushed across the street, leaping onto cars and barreled full force into the police line. At the next intersection, the Chevron building soared skyward out of a cloud of white smoke, like the space shuttle on its launch pad. Its gilded revolving doors were guarded by an arc of police cruisers and orange water barrels, beyond which was mayhem. Cops and protesters colliding, spinning in pairs as if it were a lurid high school dance. A fire engine edged forward, its sides crawling with people. She couldn't find Martin, couldn't breathe through the smell of gasoline. The pipe hung heavy at her side. A surge in the crowd knocked her off balance, and when she righted herself, they were sprinting past, a dozen bodies in black masks, smashing into the cops with loud grunts and the clamor of metal on pavement, and then she was running after them, struggling to get closer to those golden doors. She could hear herself screaming, She stumbled and went down, and a pile of bodies fell on top of her and rolled and quickly scattered. There was another explosion. There were cops on the ground protecting themselves with riot shields. Leo rose to her knees, uncertain and disoriented. They were counting on her. She could hear the thud of clubs against soft tissue. She could taste filthy copper on her tongue. And as she climbed to her feet, a skeleton-suited body fell into her, and she shoved him back with an animal cry and shook herself free. Step by step, she pushed forward, dazzled by flames until she was only a dozen yards from the revolving golden doors. When the smoke briefly cleared, she saw a body on the ground, set upon by 5 cops, one of whom tore off the attacker's mask, while the rest slammed nightsticks at his limbs, drove the butts into his belly, kicked at his ribs. Leo could not move. The sirens wailed, and the man on the ground curled up and rolled side to side, but she could not make herself move forward. When the cop holding the mask took a running step and aimed his boot at Martin's head, Leo dropped the pipe she was holding and ran. Eyes streaming, she elbowed across the current, stumbled on bottles and bricks, and tripped at the curb, tearing the flesh from her palms as she fell. She dodged through a gap in the police line and headed away from Market Street, at each intersection turning from smoke and noise into the eerie stillness of downtown. She could hear herself panting, whimpering. She stopped on a dark corner to pull off the mask and retch hot mucus into a trash can. A fire engine screamed past, and she started to run again. In Union Square, there were cops everywhere, lining every sidewalk. She wiped her nose, spat in the gutter, and ducked into the first set of doors to stand blinking and heaving in the crystal white light of Macy's perfume department. Later that night, the war would begin. Baghdad lit up with tracer fire, glowing submarine green on CNN, the silent and unreal world of alien life forms doomed to extinction. There would be tomcats and prowlers, hellfire and scuds, bombs that found their targets and bombs that found something else. Human shields, Abram tanks, retreating Iraqi soldiers slaughtered from the air while oil fires billowed black and greasy against the sky. There would be stories about U.S. arms sold to Saddam, doctored satellite photos, PR firms paid to invent Iraqi atrocities. And through it all, you could hear the chatter of Wolf Blitzer and Bernie Shaw, the stern compassion of Tom Brokaw, and the bland assurances of the president, who that first night explained to us, there are things worth fighting for. But in this moment, there was only the chilly light of the showroom, the tick and buzz of fluorescents, the whispers of other customers when they caught sight of the girl in black with a livid face and bleeding hands. Is there something I can help you with? A skinny Asian saleswoman stood flanked by 2 co-workers. They closed ranks at the Chanel counter, trying to maintain their staged elegance, like figures in a Nagel sketch that someone is about to burn. No, I'm... Leah was shaky-kneed, her blood pounding. Police cars wailed past on Stockton Street, blue light fracturing across the mirrored counters. I'm okay. I'm sorry, said the saleswoman, but you'll have to leave. Leo forced her breathing to slow. I'm looking for the men's department. The women folded their arms. Willing her hand not to shake, Leo took her Stanford Visa card from her pocket and summoned a voice learned in the shopping malls of her youth. I'm here to buy a birthday present for my father. Is there a problem? Before they could reply, she spotted the escalator and strode past the women with her chin high. She rode up 3 flights, swallowing ripples of sobs, washed her face in the ladies' room and browsed a good long time until her eyes dried, her limbs stopped shaking, until she found the perfect gift, a silk tie, an abstract blaze of blue and red, designed, the label said, by Jerry Garcia. Thank you for listening. I can hear the applause from all over the internet. That was an excerpt from The Gringa, out now from Melville House Press, and if you're interested in it, please think about buying it from 20 Stories, because they've been really wonderful to me and to lots of authors, including Darcie Dennigan, who I think people running the tech here will get her on screen now. Hi there, Darcie.
Hey.
It's nice to see you, even though we're about 8 blocks away from each other.
I know, Andrew. I'm really glad you read that excerpt, and it makes me want to go right to a difficult question, but I'm going to start with an easy one.
Okay.
But I want to go back to that excerpt because it sort of sets up one question I really want to ask you perfectly. But my first easy question is just when and where and how did you become taken with the story of Lori Berenson?
Right. So Lori Berenson is the figure who sort of inspired the novel. And she was arrested in 1995 in Lima. I lived in Peru for a couple of years in the late 90s. It was after her arrest and her trial. But she was still very much a public figure. Every time there was some kind of movement in her trial or a new motion or something needed to be reconsidered, she would be all over the media again. And she inspired a kind of loathing from Peruvians of all political backgrounds that really confused and sort of frightened me. And I didn't know very much about the case, except that she and I had some things in common. We were born the same year. We both grew up in the New York area, both come from secularized Jewish families, both went to good schools, both, have left-leaning politics, but here I was kind of living this totally irresponsible, carefree life in Peru, whereas she had come down there to take action for causes that she really believed in, and now she was sitting in a military prison. And I got fascinated with this question of, why one of us kind of went in a certain direction and the other went in such a radically different direction. And I grew kind of slowly fascinated with the story over time. It wasn't until much later, though, when she was paroled in 2010, and I happened to be in Peru again at that time, and it, even 15 years later, inspired the same kind of outpouring of fury, and there were death threats against her, there were death threats against her lawyer, there were death threats against the judge who approved her parole. And at that point, I was a writer. I had written a couple of novels and sort of knew that feeling of, here's a novel I'm going to have to write, because I needed to try to find a way to understand it through fiction.
Yes, I have a lot of questions about that.
Okay.
Do you think that going deeply into her story and trying to understand through fiction why she went this way, do you think it changed you in some way to have sort of lived through this and to have written this?
It made me think a lot about who I am and what have been willing in my life to put on the line or to risk for the things I believe in. And the answer is not very much. I mean, the character Andres, who sort of is and isn't me, it's not an autobiographical novel, but he's also an expat living in Peru. A little bit later, he's gone to Peru after the second Gulf War, after the Iraq invasion in 2003, and especially after the photographs from the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq came out showing the detainee abuses by American forces, and he sort of left the country in disgust. He said, I don't want to be an American anymore. I don't recognize this place. But in Peru, all he really does is kind of go out dancing and try to pick up the local girls and really act like the kind of irresponsible, obnoxious, privileged American that, frankly, is the stuff of a lot of expat novels in our tradition. And so I wanted to write a novel that really looked at that and asked, why do we celebrate stories of Americans going to other cultures to have a good time or to find themselves, when it's really just another kind of cultural appropriation. It's sort of using the backdrop of another people and another culture and another place as sort of window dressing for your own voyage of personal discovery. And that was not the novel I wanted to write either. But kind of
for people who haven't read it, I thought it was really funny that the Andres character is writing a book called The Moon Also Rises, and very unselfconsciously telling people that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the life he's leading. He might as well be Jake Barnes running around Paris and Pamplona, without even having Jake Barnes's sadness or wounds. But he's down there. He says he's going to write a new novel, and but all he can think to write about is himself until he gets he's running out of money, and he gets an offer to write a story about Leonora Gelb on the occasion of her parole, and he doesn't really have any choice but either to write the story or to go back to the U.S., which he's not prepared to do. But in any case, I mean, it was sort of a hard journey for myself, kind of taking a look at my own life and the question of, what do people do when they find themselves surrounded by injustice, when they feel that what's happening in the world is intolerable? In 2003, when we invaded Iraq again, I did what lots of people did. I went to marches in San Francisco that changed nothing. I wrote polemics in the Huffington Post that changed nothing. It didn't matter, right? I mean, we invaded anyway, despite hundreds of thousands or millions of people around the world protesting it. And so there are people, Leonora Gelb being one of them, who simply find that intolerable and say, well, if we can't change things by peaceful means, then we need to investigate other means. I've never gone there. I don't think I would ever have the guts to go there, leaving aside the moral question of whether that's the right thing to do. But it was really hard to kind of interrogate my own sense of commitment towards my own politics. And I don't think I loved what I found.
Right, but it also doesn't seem that you loved what you found about Lori Berenson or Leonora Gelb. I mean, in the excerpt that you read, she's there with her boyfriend, at this protest, and she's not the one getting beaten by the police. She's the white girl who can put down the lead pipe and walk into a department store and flash her Stanford visa. And, and it made me think, you describe in great lengths in the book the kind of compulsion she feels to help people in the ways that she feels, worthless unless she's helping these people that, she just decided that these Peruvians are the people she's helping. But you also, it seems like at bottom every time in almost every scene, and even, when she's going back to Cannondale or wherever you have her go, it seems that, it doesn't matter that she doesn't have money, and it doesn't matter that she doesn't have freedom, that she's in jail, that unless she was actually able to give up the privilege of her skin color and the privilege of being an American, like, she will never not have anything to lose. And so she will never not be helping people out of anything but a vanity. I don't know. Do you think that's a fair characterization of how Leonora comes across?
I'm not crazy about the word vanity. I
only say it because she keeps saying it to herself.
Yeah, well, right, exactly. And I mean, she has a good long time to sort of think about who she is and how she got to where she is. And by the way, these are not spoilers, because you find out in the opening pages of the novel that she will be arrested and tried and convicted and spend 10 years in prison. And then the rest of the novel goes on to kind of try to excavate how we got there. So yeah, she has a long time to sort of think about it. And there's this moment, especially, I think maybe you're thinking of this moment when she's in this military prison, and her cellmate is tortured and eventually killed in a raid by special forces during a prisoner strike. And one of the other prisoners says, this would never happen to you, meaning that even in this prison 14,000 feet above sea level in the Andes, far from anyone who ever has known her, because she is American, she's protected in a way. And that's an incredibly painful thing for her to come to understand about herself, that there is no escaping the privilege. You cannot renounce the kind of privilege that we as Americans have. I mean, the kinds of Americans who are able to go abroad to reinvent themselves, either to become sort of feckless discoteca loungers, or to join the movement, to join the revolution, right? I mean, the fantasy that we can disappear into another culture, become part of another culture, it's exactly that, a fantasy. And so she has to sit there for years and think, you know, did I do good by trying to help? Did I do bad? Did I do anything at all? And it's a tough pill, and there's not a great answer for her.
But the excerpt that you read was in America. You know, it was set.
Yeah.
You know, East Palo Alto. I don't know exactly. In Oakland, maybe.
Downtown San Francisco.
Downtown San Francisco.
Yeah.
So I mean, it also sort of seemed to be saying, you know, like you will always be, no matter how much you sort of give to a cause, you will always be seeing that cause and the people that you think you're fighting for as the other.
Right. Right.
And go ahead.
I think that's often true. I mean, if you think about you know, violent movements in the United States, right? I mean, all of the Weather Underground kids were middle class or upper middle class white kids, right? And they wanted to be in solidarity with the Black Panthers, with the Black Power movement, and the Black Panthers basically said, no thanks. And in Peru, a lot of the group that Leonora Gelb joins is not the Shining Path, just as the group that Laurie Berenson was involved with was not the Shining Path. The Shining Path was more or less a bona fide Maoist peasant war. I mean, most of the people, certainly the ones on the front lines, were you know, came from nothing. They were subsistence farmers. Their leaders were founded by a university professor at the University of Ayacucho, and the Tupac Amaru movement, which Laurie Berenson joined. A lot of them were middle class or upper middle class Lima kids, right? So the question is there a value to those people fighting for those whom they see as oppressed or underprivileged, because they'll be the ones with less to lose in that fight? And yet, like you say, for many of them, it's hard to escape that feeling of, you know, I'm helping those people, right? Those others, and it's just a conundrum, right? I mean, we want there to be as many people fighting for justice as possible, but these are really complicated questions of class and privilege and perspective, and it was really hard to kind of fight my way through them in this book.
What I kept thinking is, well, I had a lot of things about time in this book, but do you think that those are what you were talking about grappling with in terms of those people and being like on the side of the revolution, on the side of people who are oppressed? Do you think that now is outdated? Do you think that things have changed significantly in America in the past 2 decades, that question is moot, or is that?
Well, I think the discourse has changed radically in the last 19 and a half years, not to put too fine a point on it. I think that the kind of outpouring and protests that we saw after 9/11 and in opposition to the Iraq War for a very long time, that really tamped down. I mean, the idea of active protest in this country in the age of the so-called war on terror, there was just much less of an appetite or a tolerance for it, even in the so-called, you know, moderate left. I mean, we've seen a little bit of an upsurge of it again in the last few years, which I'm happy about. I mean, the women's marches and lots of protests to some of the things that the Trump administration is doing, especially at the border. But we get to the same place, right? Which is anyone listening? if we bring 1 million people to downtown Washington, D.C., and they just ignore us, what have we accomplished? I would like to be among those who think that it all adds up, and that eventually it moves the needle, that eventually the arc of, what is it, the arc of history bends toward justice. But I have a hard time with it. I'm less optimistic than that.
But I mean, this is your second book that is about a woman who's angry. Like it seems that you are. It seems that there's something that's sort of alluring to you in this sort of extreme. I'm just thinking about your first novel, Lady Lazarus, and the similarities, the parallels between that one and GRINGA, for instance, that the character is a recognizable person from history. Seems like she's Kurt Cobain's daughter. Not exactly Frances Bean, but like someone Frances Bean could have been. The writer is also a character in a sense in that book. And you actually said in an interview, let me just find it, female anger to me is just more interesting and complicated than male anger, which bores me at this point. And I'm wondering, did it seem like there was something you hadn't explored, maybe some utility or futility with female anger that you didn't get to with Calliope that you needed to explore with Leonora?
Wow, that's an amazing question, and I hadn't even really sort of thought about some of the parallels in the structures of the two books. So that's interesting. I mean, I want to think about that a lot. To try to answer it, briefly now. It's true that I find male anger, white American male anger, incredibly boring and tedious, and the world's tiniest violin a lot of the time. Not that there aren't people who have plenty of things to be angry and upset about, but the way that male anger manifests right now in our country is, I think it's a social pathology, whereas, in these two characters, their anger has a lot to do with the way that the world insists on telling them who they are and what their possibilities are and what their horizons are, and the kind of desperate determination to prove other people wrong. I mean, to have just the opportunity to define themselves when all around them, whether it's family or media or a corrupt legal system, are trying to define them for themselves, for the general public. And so that struggle to me, to declare one's own identity and to push back against all of the forces that would tell you who you are and who you can be, that I think is the link between the two novels. That's the fascination for me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there's more, but we can get to that
Yeah,
in another
sure. And
conversation.
I don't know. Let me just ask the bookstore. We're good. We keep going. Okay. All right.
Okay. So just to sort of stay with the idea, I mean, I'm also fascinated to, that two of your novels are built around these female characters. And I wonder, you said that the political discourse had radically changed, and the discourse around writing and what writers can or should write has also, I think, sharpened in its intensity. And, a lot of people are sort of saying, stay in your lane. And did you have any sort of conflict or a greater self-consciousness choosing to write a female character in 2020 as opposed to when you wrote Lady Lazarus in 2007?
Well, let's put it this way. Writing a female character was one of a long list of tremendous ethical and artistic minefields that I found myself trying to tiptoe through in writing this book, and it's one of the reasons that it took me 8 years to write it. I mean, I'm not only writing about a female character, but I'm writing about a female character who is a privileged American against the backdrop of another culture, another language, another country and its history, a history which in recent decades had experienced a dirty war that claimed 70,000 lives. And the question that I was continually asking myself for years as I was trying to write this book and trying out different perspectives and different structures for it and not getting anywhere was, who am I to write this story, right? Who am I to try to say something about another country's history, another country's trauma? Then I had this fascinating conversation. I was in Lima, it was 2012. I'd been working on the book for a couple of years and I was getting nowhere. And I was talking to a journalist I know, a Canadian journalist who has lived in Lima since the very early 1990s, who had covered the Dirty War, who had briefly covered the Laurie Berenson trial. And I was laying out these problems to her and I said, I don't think I can write this book. I don't think I have any right to try to write this story. Who am I to be writing this story? And she looked at me and she said, you know who you are? You're Laurie. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, think about it. I mean, Laurie came down here. She thought she knew something about this country. She didn't really know very much about this country. She thought that she wanted to help people. She didn't end up really helping anybody. She thought she could inject herself into another people's history, into another people's conflict and another people's oppression. And she failed. I mean, she made a mess of it and she paid a terrible price for it, but not nearly the price that 70,000 Peruvians had paid. She was an interloper. She was a gringa. And that's who you are. And I was really a little shocked by this. But then I understood that what she meant was that's the perspective the novel can be written from. That's the only honest perspective that the novel can be written from. And that's how I ended up with this character, Andres, who, the novel is very straightforward in its opinion of him. He is, he's a layabout. He's just a privileged jerk with a little money in his pocket, trying to have a good time, trying to reinvent himself, living in Peru, bringing nothing to Peru, but just taking for himself. And so his
getting
encounter,
a woman pregnant, and yeah,
right. He gets his girlfriend pregnant, which is one of the other reasons he takes on the story he writes, is so that he has an excuse to get out of town. I mean, this guy is a selfish schmuck, and but through that perspective, I was then able to sort of enact exactly those ethical conflicts, because he's got no business writing this story either. And he's fucking it up pretty badly. But he's also coming to see through his considerations of Leonora and what she did, or what she was alleged to have done. He's coming to have a kind of perspective on himself that he badly, badly needs, and coming to realize just how little he's really ever contributed or put on the line for anything in his life. I don't know if that's the perfect answer. I mean, the perfect answer might have been for me not to write this book at all. But I felt like if I could come to a place where the book was really grappling with these ethical problems of privilege and of cultural appropriation, that maybe it could be a valuable exploration of these issues at the same time as it was trying to bring some kind of awareness through fiction to what had happened in Peru in these terrible years.
I can see the character of Stephanie and your Canadian friend that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I can see how Andres functions in the book, and as sort of the sort of like ethical kind of the way to investigate the ethics of telling this story. But then there's this other layer of his name being Andres. There's this layer of it feeling like autofiction. And I'm wondering what you think the book gains by hewing so closely to your life and your name.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't think it hews that closely to my life, except insofar as I lived a couple of years in Peru, and that was, I mean, I got a lot more out of my living in Peru than Peru did, for sure.
You are not the king of salsa when you lived there.
I was not the king of salsa. Okay. But it's possible that giving him my name in some ways, I'm just thinking of this now, like maybe there was a kind of penance that I was trying to do. Maybe there was a way that I was trying to call my younger self out for who I was and how narrow my perspectives were, and how I comported myself and what I was and was not interested in during that time. But I also think that at least at first, at least on a conscious level, what I was trying to do was to sort of interrogate this line between fact and fiction. I mean, the novel obviously is inspired by real events. Anyone who reads it who has, a vague sense of the historical events that inspired it, there's always going to be a kind of split screen in reading it between, the novel as it's told, which is pure fiction, and, what any of us know of the real life events. And I think I wanted to make that even more complicated, right? Because I wanted to ask these questions about how do we narrativize history? How do we narrativize atrocity? How do we take the stuff of real life, which is often incredibly painful and incredibly chaotic, shape it into a well-wrought story that a publisher in New York might want to publish without sort of unforgivably distorting it, without turning it into some kind of garbage. I mean, the writer Miriam Gerba, in writing about American Dirt recently, I don't know if she coined the term, but she's talked about American Dirt as trauma porn, right? And that was the last thing I wanted to write, and it came to seem to me that the only way to avoid writing that was to aim right at the question and to really force readers to confront at every turn the relationship between the story and the real life background, even if that meant sort of offering up myself or some kind of funhouse mirror version of myself on the kind of altar of criticism for the novel, to say, we can't necessarily, certainly nowadays, we can't necessarily find that line the way we used to between storytelling and history or fact. And I wanted to make that a real challenge in the book. So I think, at least at first, that was why his name was Andres. It may have changed along the way. I don't know that I'm totally conscious of all the reasons.
I mean, for me as your reader, the line kept sort of slipping, but that was kind of pleasurable. You were talking earlier about the term cultural appropriation, and Zadie Smith had that essay in the New York Review of Books in October where she says, like, what if we didn't call it that? And she had a bunch of other terms we could think about calling it. One of them was the fascination of presumption. And I kept sort of slipping into, because you would imagine these scenes and then I would fall into thinking they're true because of the similarities between Leonora and Laurie Berenson, and then kind of slip out and like look at my own sort of process, and like it is sort of fascinating when I can like believe a fiction, and then watching sort of Andres try to investigate his own sort of presumptions, and it was really cool. There were so many levels. It was sort of like a dizzy metacognition kind of read.
Well, I should use that for a blurb on the paperback. A dizzy metacognition kind of read. I love it.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad you found it pleasurable. I hope many readers will. I think the question of cultural appropriation aside, there were all these questions for me just about how anybody writes anything, whether we call it fiction or nonfiction, and I was thinking about how much we don't know about the real Laurie Berenson case. The story has like tons of holes that have just never been filled in. Journalists have never really been able to figure out like what she was doing in that house in Lima. And then as I was trying to write it, it just occurred to me, well, most of what we think of as history, or at least historiography, must be like this. I mean, the writer at some point has to be imagining, whether it's, you know, something as simple as like the specifics of dialogue, or like, you know, what happened on a given day that didn't make it into the newspaper. So how much of what we read and we consider it to be factual, you know, the back of the book says nonfiction, right? A lot of that is imagined or pieced together, or at the very least shaped so that it gives a reader a satisfying experience. But, you know, life isn't shaped. Life is not a satisfying experience, at least not in the narrative sense. And so I was fascinated by this idea of like, well, sure, I'm writing a novel, but it's a novel, the conceit of which is that the one of the characters is trying to write a true story, and he just can't. I mean, he doesn't have access to the truth. And I was fascinated all along with this idea of like, this must happen all the time. I mean, this must be a lot of what we come to understand as history, particularly history of conflict, history of atrocity, right? I mean, if you don't have firsthand witnesses, then at some level you're just making it up.
Even if you do have firsthand witnesses, you can't, you know, you can't understand what you're seeing as you're seeing it. I was thinking, I read that New Yorker review of the Jenny Offal book, Weather.
Yeah.
And my friend and I have been talking about it. The title of the review is "Our Novels Trapped by the Present," and, you know, and thinking about like there's so much in this book that I kind of had to keep sort of going back and being like, what year are we? Because I kept thinking, are we in 2018? Yeah, and it made me think: when Trump was elected, did you have to change anything you were writing or the way you were writing it? How much did that affect your book?
It's funny. I didn't change very much because the book was I would say 90% finished by 2016. I mean, it was clear to me that you know, with the whole in the era of fake news, certain things in the book were taking on even greater resonance. But the interesting thing for me is that the book was actually mostly written during the Obama administration, but in terms of its politics and in terms of like whatever anger the book itself embodies, I was writing towards the George W. Bush presidency and the invasion of Iraq, which was, you know, a complete falsehood that resulted in the death of 500,000 Iraqi people, 4,000 American soldiers, millions of people were dislocated. And the Patriot Act and abuses in our own country. I mean, I started writing this book as a kind of cry of fury against what our country had become during those 8 years. Little did I know, or never could have guessed, that there would come a day when, you know, there are moments when we miss George W. Bush, right? I mean, there are moments when we realize, oh, we thought he was bad. And there are ways in which what we have now is worse. There are also ways in which nothing could ever be worse than the crimes that Bush and his administration committed. But so there was a kind of strange shift for me in the context once we moved into this new era, which, you know, maybe God, I hope not, but maybe I'll have to write another book about how I feel about this presidency. I think, do you want to ask one more, or should we kind of wrap there?
Okay.
Yeah, if anyone listening wants to type in a question, I guess that's how it works. I'm happy to answer a question from anyone out in the world. Will I see them?
Yeah.
If they do? Okay.
But you can keep them.
Yeah, in the meantime, Darcie.
Okay, well, I mean, I have a bunch of questions, but this one I just want to ask because, you know, it's only got to be some like hardcore literary geeks on a Friday night watching this, right? So the book that Leonora is carrying around the whole time that she's in Peru is Moby Dick, but it's not a book that she chose to bring with her. It's a book her father gave to her. But like every chapter, it seems to take on more and more significance until it's like almost too heavy to hold. And I'm just wondering if you would talk a little bit about how you decided that Moby Dick would be the book, and yeah, take it from there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think really this is kind of one of those happy accidents that writers sometimes have. I mean, I needed there was a point where I was writing a scene where she, you know, her parents had given her a gift when she left for Peru, and so her dad gave her kind of like a nice leather-bound edition of Moby Dick. I just kind of pulled it out of a hat, and Moby Dick is my wife's favorite novel, and I should shout out to my wife Wahini Vara and my son Kavi, who I think are probably listening or watching right now. Hello. So I put Moby Dick in just kind of randomly, but then of course, you know, it must have come from my unconscious at some level, because of course I start thinking about Ahab and his determination and how it destroys everything around him, and also the fact that Leonora's father has written on the flyleaf to her, completely misunderstanding the book and its import. He says something like, you know, to my little Ahab, you know, good luck chasing your dreams, or something. I mean, just a total misunderstanding, a well-meaning, good-hearted one. I mean, he loves his daughter, and he's excited and nervous for her. But of course, that's the horrible resonance of Moby Dick, is that determination is not only his downfall, but the downfall of everyone around him. You want to wrap? Okay. I just want to say one more time, thank you so much to 20 Stories, 20storiesla.com. Please buy my book, Darcie's books, from their website. All your books. Support local bookstores. Thank you, Darcie, for this terrific conversation. Thank you for everybody who took time out in this really weird
moment.
Thank
you for your book. I'm just gonna, so people can see.
I'll hold it up.
It's an awesome book. I had the worst week, and I still wanted to read it till late in the night.
Well, you're wonderful for doing this, and I'm going to turn it over to Alexa again now. But thank you, everybody, for listening, and stay healthy and stay safe, and we're all going to get through this, I hope. Good night.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for coming by and listening to that. That was really awesome. Once again, thanks to Andrew and Darcie for doing this. We have signed copies available in store as well as online at 20storiesla.com/shop. Otherwise, have a good night and stay well. Bye.